Hello, welcome to Mrs. Browning's YouTube Huck Finn review session. We'll see if this works or not. Hopefully it'll help you out. I've shown you this first quote before, and I think it bears repeating. It's a worthy thing to fight for one's own freedom. It's another sight finer to fight for another man's. I think this is an issue that plagues Twain throughout his lifetime. If you've taken the time to look at the PowerPoint about Twain's history that I put online, and if you have not yet done that, you should. If you did that a while ago, it bears a repeat viewing because I've added some additional information to it. Although certainly he is a humorist. Notice I didn't say comedian, but humorist. I think it's important to know that the complexities of life plagued him. And as with all, even comedians who are usually plagued by something, this shows up in his writing time and time again. And I think the thing that gets him the most is how cruel humans are. And yet it's part of our human nature. It's hard to avoid, and everyone is guilty of it at one point or another. But then I look at the second quote, which I think I've shared with you, but let's say it again. I have been reading the newspaper. I do it every day, knowing full well that I shall find in it the usual depravities and basenesses and hypocrisies and cruelties that make up civilization, and cause me to put in the rest of the day pleading for the damnation of the human race. I cannot seem to get my prayers answered. Yes, I do not despair. And this is often this idea of the damnation of the human race changed to the damned human race. Either way you leave it, it's something that appears in the Adventures of Huck Finn. So you're going to find that these notes are in two parts. The first part is going to deal with the characters. And I've got some notes that I'm going to give you and talk about these. And then part two, which will be a second installment of Mrs. Browning's YouTube Huck Finn review, is going to deal more thematically. This is going to be online, so that if you want to access it later, you can, but certainly pay attention. So I just thought I'd show you my favorite picture of Mark Twain, friendly-looking soul that he is, and this great postcard from Hannibal, Missouri, to remind you what the name of his boyhood home was. And then there's this great stone at the headwaters in Minnesota, where I will be, not at the headwaters, but I'll be in Minnesota while you're studying. It says here, 1,475 feet above the ocean, the mighty Mississippi begins to flow on its winding way 2,552 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. So being the excellent sophomore honors English student that you are, I know you all happen to have handy your copy of The Adventures of Huck Finn. Go to the very beginning of the novel, and that's not chapter 1, but that's that page before it. It's that page that I tell you should always take the time to read, even though you want to skip over it and get right to the meat of the novel, because when an author puts information there at the beginning, either in a foreword or a acknowledgement or something, he's giving you some piece of information that hopefully will be helpful to you later. This notice where he says persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted, persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished, and persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot, is a fabulous example of hyperbole. And hyperbole, as you all remember, I'm certain, is some kind of gross exaggeration. Hopefully this is something you'll be able to use later in your life. But when we have it, he's telling us that there is no motive, there's no moral, and there's no plot. Well, I'm hoping that now that you're finished with the novel, you're going to know that indeed there is motive, there is a moral, and there is a plot. And those are things I want you to think about, because I think that if you can understand what the motive is, if you can understand what the moral is, and if you can understand, I hope, what the plot is, you're going to get what it is Twain is really trying to do here. It's not just, and I've said this over and over again, it's not just the story of two guys floating down a river together, but he's making a commentary on life. So here are the three parts of the novel. We've got chapter 1 through 16. And remember, this concludes part 1 when they miss Cairo in the fog. And Twain stops writing for 2 years. He doesn't know what to do anymore. Then we come to chapter 17 through 31, which is part 2. And we get the feud and we get the adventures of the king and the duke. And I would suggest that there's a lot going on in this part. In a lot of this, I think, deals with eventually showing how Huck has developed as an individual. There are different stepping stones along the way that make him a better person. And we get to see that relationship between Huck and Jim. And then we get part 3. And part 3 is the very end. I think this is the section that reads pretty quickly. And this really all focuses on Tom Sawyer, either Huck pretending to be Tom Sawyer or Tom Sawyer entering in. And, you know, they've got, in typical Tom fashion, this fabulous way to get Jim to escape. And Jim, you know, the irony is that he doesn't need to escape because he is freed. But it's almost as if Tom is braver in concocting all this adventure because he knows that there's really no downside for Jim, because no matter what happens, Jim is finally going to be free. So here we have Huck Finn. And Huck is our character, he's our protagonist, he's our voice. He is responsible for much of the humor in the novel. And most of that humor is because he interprets things so literally. And it's almost as if, in some cases, his mind just functions as a reporter. And if you think about that, that's Twain's background. That's what he grew up with. That's where he got his education. He started out working for his brother's newspaper as a typesetter. Then, except for the brief stint on the steamboats of the Mississippi, then he goes out west and he becomes the society reporter in San Francisco. So that makes sense that that's how he relays information to his audience. Huck is funny because he can't see the incongruities of everyday life. There's many times where he is subtly humorous. Twain is. That one of my favorites is very early in page 3, where he says they're talking about, you know, heaven and hell and how wicked he was and what was going to happen and how she was going to go to the good place. And Huck says to her, I asked if she reckoned Tom Sawyer would go there, and she said not by a considerable sight. I was glad about that because I wanted him and me to be together. There's no gray area with Huck Finn. There's none, and that leads to much of the humor. I've given this to you, but we're going to go over it again. So Huck is our central figure. He's our protagonist. And as a narrator, he's our mouthpiece for Twain. And think about this. Think about, we've got the feud, and what else do we have? We have the section with Colonel Sherburne. And that is certainly, there goes my handwriting, that is certainly Twain's voice here. He is speaking his mind through our protagonist. He's good-hearted, he's imaginative, he's clever, he's no traditional faith that we're aware of. He's a literalist. He believes things the way they are, and that's why, you remember we've talked about superstitions, why he is so susceptible to superstition. A great deal of common sense, he's adaptable, and he rejects the traditional values of society. So here we've got Tom Sawyer, who is a great contrast with Huck. And I know that he is only in the novel for a few chapters at the beginning and a few chapters at the end, but certainly he is a role model for Huck, and he is someone to whom he refers quite often. He represents the values of society, in Tom conforms to societies. And I would say that he conforms to those societies because he really doesn't take much of a risk, ever. He does things when it's safe. Think at the very end, all those risks he's willing to make with poor Jim to set Jim free, and he already knows that he is free. So you're really not taking a risk when you do that kind of thing. Tom is a romantic. He imitates books rather than life, and he says it often over and over. He'll say things like, well, it says it in the book, so that's what we got to do. He is very, very self-centered, never thinks about Huck, and especially at the end, thinks about what poor Jim has been going through, and yet he's free, and it takes him quite a long time to tell him that. And he is the child counterpart to the king and duke. Jim has to be one of my favorite characters in the novel. He is a major character. He's not necessarily our protagonist, but he is the gauge for Huck's moral development. And that's so important. This development that Huck undergoes. I would suggest that if we look back at what we said about the damned human race in Mark Twain, that he looks at Huck's moral development as hope for the human race. Jim's our one truly moral character. He's got good sense. He loves his family. He selflessly loves and cares for Huck and even Tom, and he is definitely the surrogate father for Huck. So here we have two sets of characters that definitely contrast with one another. We have the Widow Douglas and Miss Watson, and they represent religion, the middle class value. They're not very much in this novel, are they? Although certainly Miss Watson at the end, by her absence, plays a nice role. Then we have the King and the Duke, and they are in contrast to the Widow Douglas and Miss Watson, because they are materialistic, they are con men, and they represent not the ant, but the antisocial tendencies of the human race. They are the worst of who we can be. And I don't know that the Widow Douglas and Miss Watson are the best of what we can be. Certainly they are more the norm, or more the acceptable norm for society. But the King and the Duke are who we don't want society becoming. And so that is the end of part 1, and we are going to end this, and we will link to part 2 themes.